My name is Melanie Kress, and I am the Associate Curator for Highline Art, the public art program presented by the Highline in New York City. I want to welcome you all and thank you for joining us for the first conversation in our six-part series of the Normalizing Gaze Surveillance from Drones to Phones. This panel being titled Tactics and Technologies, Facial Recognition to Predictive Policing. This series is organized in conjunction with artist Sam Durant's Highline Plinth Commission Untitled Drone, which opened this spring and will be on view on the Highline at 30th Street through August 2022. Untitled Drone is a large-scale fiberglass sculpture in the shape of an abstracted drone sitting atop a 25-foot steel pole. This work continues Highline Art's mission of presenting new, powerful, thought-provoking artworks that generate and amplify some of today's most important conversations. Inspired by this artwork, the speaker series brings together artists, activists, scholars, filmmakers, and journalists to demystify the twinned histories of surveillance and drone warfare and illuminate routine examples of surveillance in our daily lives. The Normalizing Gaze Surveillance from Drones to Phones is presented by the Highline and the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project, a nonprofit advocacy organization and legal services provider that litigates and advocates for privacy, working to abolish local government systems of mass surveillance. We're thrilled to have STOP's Executive Director, Albert Fox Cahn, moderating today's conversation. As we begin, I have a few announcements regarding the logistics of the event. These will be also included in the chat. All attendee videos are automatically turned off and microphones are muted. If you'd like to use the closed captioning, please go to the button at the bottom of your Zoom screen and click the CC option. Here you will be able to turn on the captions. Throughout the presentation and discussion, we invite you to ask questions. Please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen and we'll select questions for our moderator. Please use the chat to engage with other attendees and keep the conversation going. If you have technical questions, just drop them in the chat. Lastly, in the coming days after the series, a recording of this event and all the following in the series will be posted on the Highline's website for future viewing. Thank you again for attending this event, and I'd like to share a special thanks to all the Highline and STOP supporters here today. Although we are in virtual space together, before we get started, I want to acknowledge that I come to you from Brooklyn, New York today on the ancestral land of Lenape and Canarsie. If you are interested in finding the name of the indigenous people whose land you live on, please visit the link in the chat. And now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our event moderator, Albert Fox Cahn. Albert is the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project's founder and, as I said, executive director, and he's also a fellow at Yale Law School's Information Society Project, NYU Law School Engelberg Center on Innovation Law and Policy, and the Day One Project. Albert is a contributor to the New York Times, Boston Globe, Guardian, Wired, and dozens of other publications. Albert, thank you so much for joining us, organizing this series with us, and being our moderator of today's conversation.
Melanie, thank you so much for having me. Thank you to you, to the entire team at the Highline for bringing together this series. And I can't begin to tell you how excited I am to be able to kick off this discussion about the tools and technologies that are used to monitor New Yorkers as part of this broader series. You know, we have artist and filmmaker Lynn Hershman Leeson, who has been doing widely recognized and innovative work at the intersection of technology, identity, and surveillance for the last 4 decades, and has incredible retrospective exhibition titled Twisted, open at the New Museum that just opened last week. Kade Crockford is the Director of Technology for Liberty program at the ACLU of Massachusetts and has done just groundbreaking work in Massachusetts on many of the surveillance issues that we're going to be discussing today. Ángel Díaz is counsel at the Liberty and National Security Program at the Brennan Center for Justice. He's done as well groundbreaking legal work on many of these surveillance tools that we'll be discussing. He's also on the Community Advisory Board at my organization, the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project. And I really want to emphasize at the outset that we all come to these conversations about surveillance with different levels of understanding of the tools, of the tactics, of the forms of inequity that drive so many of these abuses. So please make sure that you raise your hand and raise it often, just so we can understand those perspectives. Again, using that Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So Lynn, if you could turn on your video and we can just talk quickly about Shadow Stalker.
In 2010, an anthropology professor adapted his Pentagon-funded research for forecasting battlefield casualties in Iraq to predicting crime for American police departments. Based on the predictions of earthquakes and aftershocks, he created a revolutionary algorithm capable of stopping crime before it occurred. He named it Predpol, short for predictive policing. His program claims to have reduced crime in some areas by 27%. Law enforcement agencies throughout the world, including the UK, the Netherlands, China, and this year, Korea, acquired it. Here's how it works. Officers are given maps with red squares indicating where a crime will occur. The algorithms are based on past crimes. Police patrol the 500 by 500 foot square locations looking for suspects. Most often, they are in low-income districts. Shooting or arresting people inside of an invisible red square is one example of what Miu deemed algorithmic violence, the ubiquitous violence that an automated system inflicts on people that prevents their basic rights, like privacy, owning their profile, and not giving away their digital identity. But do these little red squares that are supposed to reflect our reality actually create it? It took 2 seconds to fatally shoot Tamir Rice, a 12-year-old black boy. Does Predpol also create programming based on the embodied metrics of a cultural history of bias? Does it promote racial profiling? Authorities have created a network of networks that uses AI, facial recognition, and machine learning to identify us based on the digital shadow that we give away for free. Predictive policing is not nuanced and often inaccurate. The multitasking red squares also score zip codes, email, and credit, and could determine whether you get a bank loan or a job. Harvested personal data has become monetized. Our digital profile has become a commodity. Coded evidence of who we are can be mined by data-driven gangsters who sell our personal information to the highest bidder. Last year, data surpassed oil in value to be the most valuable asset in the world. This puts all of us in danger of suffering toxic data spills like Equifax or the hack on corrupted elections. What about algorithmic mistakes? Faulty logic. Predictive behavior and algorithms can actually construct and alter real-life behavior. If a poor student can't get a loan because they are deemed, because of their zip code, to be too risky, that cuts them off from the education that could pull them out of poverty. The red square puts us inside of a coded prison. The red square has also been a place of revolution. We decide which we will become, prisoners or revolutionaries. Democracy is fragile. If you don't believe me, listen to the spirit of the deep web.
You can trust me. I'm here to guide you. Algorithmic violence is their secret force. In case you haven't noticed, you live in a state of surveillance. It is predictive policing that sorts people by color and race, then exposes them to the authorities. It is intimidation that unmasks what is invisible to the human eye. Algorithmic violence is not just surveillance. It's sniper terrorism.
We're being watched, taking biometric data from us. We're being bullied into taking our picture in order to get our keys.
A controlled society is a paranoid society.
Thank you for that. And now, Lynn, if you could unmute and turn on your video, love to ask you about that, because there's so many, so many powerful themes to unpack. I know we just have a short time. I just want to start off by asking what drew you initially to Predpol, to surveillance, to wanting to focus on that particularly as part of this film.
Um, well, I wanted to deal with something that was happening at this point in time that was invisible, that was really contracting a particular segment of our society in a very divisive and demonic way, and try in some way to let people know what was happening so that they at least became a little bit aware of how much of their digital identity they were giving away and what that means, and particularly, with false information that can prevent their freedom.
And that's one of the things I found so powerful, especially as someone who works in this industry, trying to push back against surveillance, is the way you're able to take the invisible lines that are drawn around us and make them visible. So what could you tell me a bit more about sort of what made you focus on the red square as a theme in the film?
Well, I think that the red square has a lot of power in it. I think that it draws really from Malevich's red square. That interestingly enough, when I was recently reading about this, and Malevich painted both a red square and a black and white square, and it was recently went under some forensic surveys, and they found when they looked at the forensic scan of the red square that there was some racist language underneath it. So interestingly enough, this has, the red square has survived as a means that, one of the things that it does is redlining, and the whole history of the red square, the various histories of how the red square is used, from Time magazine to moments of oppression and moments of freedom. So the fact that this is the symbol, the aestheticized symbol for surveillance and racism, is what made it so obvious to see that how we're all incarcerated by this design that survived.
Yeah, and I think that connection to redlining, and which is a practice that for so many people is much more understood than these sorts of surveillance systems, is such a powerful linkage to make. And another thing I wanted to ask about was I was really taken the first time I saw this about the language of algorithmic violence,
Yes.
because we hear a lot about algorithmic efficacy, we hear about bias, but we rarely hear about how it can be a driver of violence. So what made you choose that particular phrasing?
Well, the phrase was coined by Mimi Uma, and she wrote a lot about it, and gave that name to the invisible violence that we all suffer from when algorithms, as I say, incarcerate us and deny us our freedom. So I just wanted to play on her term because I think it hits home the practical element of what this design and what the system actually does.
Amazing. And the other thing just that I wanted to touch on is, I think that storytellers and filmmakers have struggled with how to portray surveillance for as long as it's existed. And I think that it was really powerful that you use spoken word, that you use song as part of that. What made you decide to use that approach in trying to communicate the impact of surveillance?
I think that you can reach more people in a way that's non-threatening. And so we, whoever knows what the reaction is going to be, or even who the audience is going to be in something like this. But we thought we would try it and go for it and try to bring in as many people as we could. And of course, the spirit of the dark web speaks that way. So we had to honor her language.
And I love this anthropomorphized vision of the dark web and giving it form and giving and I think that's one of the things that's so hard about talking about these technical systems is they often are lacking in form, and even though they have such clear function. Is
Yeah.
there a part of surveillance that you particularly struggle to make visible to the audience or struggle to make salient?
Well, in the installation, and this piece existed in 3 parts, and one of the parts was putting in your email using a mobile phone and putting your email in before you entered the installation. And when you did that, as you walked in, your own shadow went into it and followed you, but inside the shadow was all the information that's on the internet, and things as abstract as who your mother's friends are. And I think people were really shocked by how much was out there, and many people didn't want to know. And I think that the idea of not wanting to know is part of the problem, that we have to really face the kind of privacy degradations that we're all living under right now, so that we can shift the emphasis towards away from victimization to control, and driving our own identities into a more productive future, or less victimized future.
I think I couldn't agree more. I think that's a really powerful note on which to transition into the broader conversation. I invite Kade and Ángel to turn on your cameras and unmute as well, as we start to try to explore some of the broader linkages here between the work that Lynn does as a storyteller and that you do as advocates and as attorneys. And I wanted to sort of start with some just basic introductory conversation topics, because I know that many of those joining us today haven't, they aren't fellow members of the Tinfoil Hat Club. They haven't heard about a lot of these surveillance technologies before. So I just wanted each of you to tell me about what is the surveillance technology that you think about most, that keeps you up at night, that you think has the most powerful impact on our society. And maybe we could start with you, Kade, and then Ángel, and then circle back to Lynn.
Sure. Well, first, thanks for having me. Very excited about this event. Lovely to be here with all of you. That's a really tough question. I'm going to go with biometric surveillance for a couple of reasons. So biometrics, for those who don't know, are physical characteristics that are unique to each person, or allegedly unique to each person. There's some debate actually about whether or not that's really true. But let's just agree on the definition of a biometric, that it's physical characteristic unique to each of us. So believe it or not, the shape of our ear is allegedly a biometric. The way we walk, our gait, our voice, the shape of our iris, our face, and there are probably others that various folks at MIT and DARPA are in the process of identifying. I think biometric surveillance is troubling for a number of reasons. Number one is that many forms of biometric surveillance can be conducted without anyone's knowledge, without the target's knowledge or consent. They can be conducted from space, actually. And that's merely because they can be conducted via video. So you could have a satellite up in space monitoring, who's walking around Times Square in New York. And theoretically, with a powerful enough camera and sophisticated video analytics software, you could identify or track people by the shape of their ear, by their face, by the way that they walk, etc. So that's one of the reasons that it's very scary to me, is because of the ability to conduct that very personalized monitoring from a distance without the knowledge or consent of the person who's being tracked. and it can be used in a dragnet fashion. So we've seen what's happened in the Xinjiang region of China, for example. The Chinese government's use of facial recognition, face surveillance technology there has been widely covered by media outlets in the United States. And it's pretty much the most dystopian possible version of biometric surveillance, because it is essentially the use of thousands and thousands of networked surveillance camera devices, enabling the government to not only see who's going where and when, but who people are walking with. The Chinese government has used it to determine how religious Muslim Uyghurs are by tracking how many times individuals enter and exit mosques in the territory. They've also apparently used it to determine whether or not somebody may be up to no good. They see this by looking at whether or not someone enters their own home from the front or rear entrance. So those are some of the reasons. The other reason, though, is that biometrics tracks our physical bodies. So, we have not kept pace in terms of law reform with the way that our cell phones or our use of the internet track our activities, associations, political inclinations, buying habits, etc., porn viewing habits. And we have a whole lot of work that we need to do in that space to catch up with the existing technology. What concerns me about biometrics is that, I can leave my phone at home if I want to go to a protest and not be tracked by the police, if I want to go and get an abortion and not be tracked by, a government that may be hostile to abortion in various states in the United States. But I can't leave my face at home. I can't leave my ears. I can't leave my voice or my gait. I carry those with me everywhere I go. And for most of us, those are immutable characteristics. We can't change them very easily. Some people who are very advanced, maybe drug traffickers, maybe getting face, surgeries to alter their faces, but most of us are not. And so my concern about that is that, and actually people like Mark Zuckerberg have talked about this in a way that is actually bone chilling. Mark Zuckerberg views biometric surveillance as kind of the final frontier, the ability he sees to link all of the information that Facebook and other companies have captured about us through our internet use with our physical movements and habits and associations. So for that reason, we at the ACLU and the ACLU of Massachusetts have prioritized trying to get ahead of biometric surveillance, because the worst thing that could happen, I think, is that we sort of just allow the expansion of biometric surveillance to occur the way that we've allowed all of these other forms of digital tracking to take place without sufficient legal protections.
Amazing. And one theme that I think really connects to Lynn's film is this idea that these technologies are capable of tracking us, of watching us, but so often we don't realize the impact that they have because we can't see them. And that asymmetry is built into both the danger of it and part of why they've been able to expand so rapidly. Oh, and for those of you who aren't familiar with the term, DARPA is the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. It is a government think tank that develops a lot of really disturbing cutting edge surveillance technologies, has done it for military applications, but also does it in a domestic context. So Ángel, next to you, what creepy technology keeps you up at night? What do you think people need to know about in this space?
Yeah, so I'm going to choose a different route and talk a little bit about social media surveillance. And I think I'm going to do that because, one, we're online, so it's useful. But I don't know about you all, but I sometimes lie when I'm on social media. I like photos of people that I don't like. I try to present myself as more intelligent or somewhat different than I am. And sometimes I try to fit in with groups that don't actually reflect what I'm like in real life. And nonetheless, all of those data inputs are being used by governments to make a number of determinations about us, about potentially whether my liking someone's photo means that I might be related to a gang, or that the way that I post on social media makes me unlikely to be a productive member of society, so therefore maybe I shouldn't be eligible for a particular visa or for citizenship. Or maybe the way that I criticize a particular politician is drowned out by the reality of thousands of other bot accounts that are saying positive things about that same politician. The reality is that unlike with biometric surveillance, where there's more of an understanding that you are moving somewhere and there's somewhat of a connection to who you are, even though, as Kade said, it's not necessarily 100% accurate. When it comes to social media, the data just really isn't very reliable at all. And the people that are making determinations about the data oftentimes have a very skewed, potentially racist, or at the very least just ill-equipped to make determinations about how particular communities use the internet and what they say when they're online. Nonetheless, they are very much empowered to make those decisions, and oftentimes the decisions are made in invisible ways, and you may never know that information about what you said on social media is landing you on a gang database or some other watch list that is subsequently used to continue a lot of the very same stop and frisk and other sort of discriminatory policing practices that have been going on for a very long time. And I think we'll get into it a little bit further later on, but one of the big issues with social media is that it allows police officers to do a lot of discriminatory hunches that would probably be impermissible if they were visible on the streets. But when it's just behind a computer, no one really knows what's going on.
Completely. And again, it's so much of it is unregulated and hidden from view. Lynn, turning to you, I was wondering, were there any technologies that you thought about including in your film but ruled out because you thought they might be too hard to convey as part of this conversation? Because obviously Predpol is rightfully the focus of your film, but I wanted to, it's always interesting to hear what sort of is on the cutting room floor, so to speak.
Yeah, well, it didn't quite get there, but I do want to do another sequel to this, and I've been thinking a lot about how most of these systems that are in place were really invented by the military. The word cyborg itself was coined by NASA, and the internet is and I think that part of the DNA of all of these systems is that it's meant in some way to be assaultive, and that this has really influenced, I think, a lot of the assaults that are taking place progressively, almost a pandemic of assaults, because they were part of why these algorithms were written. So I want to do something about that, and about who we're fighting and what war we're fighting, and who the enemy really is, and how we can subvert that kind of oppression, because the prejudice is coded into the algorithmic core of the internet. No matter who's programming it, there are cultural biases that show up. And I also think that again that surveillance has to do with biometric tactics, not just on the outside, but through our DNA itself, and looking at our histories, and being able to determine who can go through a door, depending on what the long-term past history of their bloodstream shows. So there are many ways of keeping us under this cloud of suppression and of surveillance that have to be investigated and uncovered.
And I think there's such a strong linkage between that sort of military surveillance complex and the way that we've seen surveillance being used in the domestic policing realm, whether it's the way that's been weaponized alarmingly against BLM protesters, or the ways that we see surprising numbers of progressive advocates supporting surveillance in the aftermath of 1/6. And I know we have a question from the audience on that point, and so I would just encourage everyone to keep submitting those questions with the Q&A tool. We'll be getting to those at the end. But I think a lot of the ways that we were talking about surveillance, that it is the state taking action on its own. But I want to sort of go back to a theme that Ángel raised, which is the way that there is all of this data in commercial spaces that is being weaponized by police. And so Ángel, maybe you could start off, and then we'll go to Kade and then Lynn, that talk about some of the ways that data flows from the private sector to the policing sector in ways that people might not expect.
Sure, I'll sort of keep it limited so that others can give other examples. But one of the things that's really gotten folks in our space really activated is a lot of the apps that you're downloading track your location, and oftentimes you just mindlessly say that's fine, or maybe you'll sometimes turn it off, or it's okay to track it while you're using the app. But I think folks may not realize that some of those apps end up selling people's location data to commercial data brokers or other organizations. One of those customers is the US government. And so in reality, we've had DHS purchasing location data in order to understand where people are moving around in areas around the border, and they're accessing that location data through commercial purchases. And if they were to try to collect that data themselves or get it from a particular vendor, they may be required to have a warrant and probable cause to show that they're doing it. But by purchasing this data, they're kind of doing an end run around the Fourth Amendment and just sort of acquiring it that way. So that's one of the ways that even the apps that you think aren't collecting that sensitive information, maybe you're just using it for a video game or something like that, it actually ends up being quite revealing and does find its way into the hands of the government through this kind of capitalism manner.
And I really think that's something that is jaw-dropping to a lot of folks when they first hear it, that, police can go ask for a warrant, get turned down, and then just buy it. That money is somehow a substitute for the Constitution. So Kade, are there any examples that come to mind for you of the ways that this information flows between the private and the policing sectors?
Yeah, I've studied fusion centers quite a bit. So fusion centers are institutions that were created by the Department of Homeland Security initially in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, because of a line from the 9/11 Commission report, which you've probably heard ad nauseum, that law enforcement failed to connect the dots. And that was one of the major reasons why the attack succeeded. Now, just sort of side note, it's not really true that that's why the attack succeeded. The FBI and the CIA both had information that they didn't share with each other. So the idea that local law enforcement, that state law enforcement, should have been sharing or providing more information is really not relevant at all to the 9/11 attacks. Nonetheless, the newly created Department of Homeland Security took that idea and ran with it and created 80 plus fusion centers, that's what they're called, all around the country, which are ostensibly run by state and local police. Some states have 2 or more fusion centers. There are 2 of them here in Massachusetts, one run by the state police and the other by the Boston Police Department. And these are places, they're essentially intelligence sharing hubs, spy centers, you could call them. They are pumped with federal and state money, oftentimes to the tune of billions of dollars nationwide over the past 20 or so years. And they allow so-called intelligence analysts to access all kinds of databases, private databases, as well as government databases, some of which were created in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. But some of those commercial side databases are really astonishingly detailed in terms of what information they provide about every single person in the United States, about every single adult. We actually have some records that we obtained from a lawsuit against the Boston Police Department that reveal, subject to merely typing in someone's name, someone who, may be suspected of a crime, or because the rules at these places are so lax and there's no real oversight of the police in the United States, maybe even someone who's just an activist the police don't like, could be a political opponent of the mayor's. It's extremely easy for them to type a name into LexisNexis. Accurate is another one of these database systems, and obtain literally 20, 40 pages of information about known associates, past addresses, credit reporting information, an entire criminal history that, you know, these companies suck up from courtrooms across the country every day. So information that is not merely about someone's interaction with the government, like a criminal history report, but really detailed information, not only about the target of the search, but also about their associates, right? Known roommates, known housemates, known, you know, property that people have paid taxes on. Does somebody own a boat? Does somebody own a car? And really just voluminous records. And there are dozens and dozens of these companies that provide services like this to government agencies all across the United States. And it's the same problem that Ángel just referenced. They don't need to get a warrant to access any of this information from an individual company like a credit reporting agency. They merely pay a subscription fee to access these records on an ongoing basis, and can query, you know, results for anyone they feel like investigating.
I think those are all great examples, and I will shamelessly plug my own class action lawsuit against Thomson Reuters for their Clear product, which, you know, sells many of these reports. And I couldn't help smiling when you were describing the known roommates and other known features, because oftentimes the people listed are unknown to those in the reports because of all of the errors. So Lynn, I wanted to ask you specifically about the linkage between poverty and policing in these databases, and the ways that I believe you referenced credit reports and other financial measures, and the ways that those then get turned into yet another measure of who is supposedly a threat.
Yeah, because I mean, the targets are generally non-white people, low-income districts, and those are the people who are victimized by 10% of police forces going out and looking for crimes before they occur and arresting them. I'm also worried about false information, because you could have somebody who applies for a loan or applies to go to college, and because of false information that's out there, they're turned down for both. And you have no way of knowing what mistakes are on the records that are really controlling your life. And that's a very, very disturbing factor. Also, I know that there are some states that have tried to create some sort of protective laws, but they don't affect the police systems and the government aren't affected by that. And there's also a lot of resistance to that. So what rights do individuals have, you know, to control their identity and to control their future, their options?
Amazing. And I think that raises a really important point about, we talk a lot about the police and the role they play in this surveillance, but often it's much broader. And I want to just talk about the general public and the way that tip lines, you know, 311, see something, say something, and all of these campaigns create a climate of suspicion and sort of turn surveillance into a much broader project. And I'm happy to open this up to anyone. How do you feel that sort of expands the harms we see in with these sorts of programs? And I know opening it up to everyone is a very dangerous practice in the land of Zoom. So Kade, thank you for unmuting.
Sure, yeah. So, you know, when you asked the question, I was thinking about some historical analogs, right? The Red Scare in the United States, a time in the 1950s when people were encouraged to rat on their family members, their coworkers, you know, to insinuate that people were affiliated with the Communist Party. There's also the historical analog in East Germany with the Stasi, where people weren't even sure they could trust their own family members because somebody might be reporting on their, you know, anti-regime political activities or even poetry to the government. And we really did see something like that after 9/11 in the United States, a resurgence of that kind of Stasi-like behavior encouraged by the government. One of those programs you mentioned is the See Something, Say Something suspicious activity reporting program. And in fact, I mentioned fusion centers before. suspicious activity reporting is one of the primary reasons that fusion centers were justified to exist. Congress was told, look, you need to fund these places because we have this suspicious activity reporting program. You know, DHS has taught the public and local police to think it's suspicious if someone is taking photographs of something that doesn't look, you know, aesthetically pleasing. If someone is standing in a place where they are kind of looking around and seem suspicious. And fusion centers to this day are tasked with accepting those reports, analyzing them, and deciding whether or not they're going to conduct a further investigation, but storing all of them, you know, just in case. And there have been very few comprehensive examinations of suspicious activity reports, but of the ones that exist, for example, NPR some years back did a study looking at suspicious activity reports at the Mall of America. And what they found is probably unsurprising to most people listening, that by and large, the people who were deemed suspicious by other members of the public were people who the reporters perceived to be Arab or Muslim, people who were just living their lives, walking around the mall, doing ordinary things, were reported to the government because their fellow residents, citizens, considered them suspicious on the basis of their appearance, on the basis of their, you know, possible association with the Muslim religion. So that report also found that there wasn't a single example in which any of that information was useful for a counterterrorism purpose, which is altogether unsurprising, because really the impact of these programs is not to protect public safety. The impact of these programs is to make people fear one another and to drive support for all sorts of other government programs undertaken by the FBI, the Department of Justice, the Department of Homeland Security, and state and local police that subject Muslims to extraordinary forms of surveillance and harassment, and frankly, terror by their own government.
And really, I think it's hard to overstate just how low the bar has been for the last 20 years to be deemed a threat or to be deemed suspicious if you're a Muslim in America. I'm thinking of clients I've represented who are, you know, a small child who was visited by the FBI because he drew a picture of an airplane at school, and that was seen as a threat. That was seen as a national security concern. And it's this highly racialized lens that, well, combined with everything else we've talked about, can make anyone who's listening to this despair. But I don't want people to just curl up into a little ball and you know, give up on society and the hope of actually pushing back. And I want to turn to all of you and ask, what are the models that give you hope? Either the models today that we see in the streets or the models historically that actually have pushed back, because oftentimes we hear that the technology makes this surveillance state inevitable, but I don't think any of us would be doing this work if we truly thought that. So happy to open it up to any of you to start. Lynn?
Well, I think that we probably need to have a new understanding of where we are, both as individuals on the planet and the planet itself, and how we're going to preserve both into the future. And because there's been so much technological weaponization of surveillance systems, I think we need to find a next generation optimistically that can create methods of coming together in a more collaborative and humane way to survive, and to also to override the demonization that and oppression that we're living under, even though we're just beginning to find out how relevant it is and how massive the scale is. So I think that most of the systems that exist right now need to be overridden by newly written programs that are not determined by a military element
It
or
makes
pornography.
It just makes me wish that it was as easy to reboot our social structures as it is to reboot a faulty piece of software. Ángel, I saw you unmuting before. What do you look to for hope in this space?
Well, before I give you some ideas of stuff we can actually do, I think it's important to really remember that over the past year, we've actually seen people take care of each other in ways that are, maybe were a little bit more invisible beforehand. We've seen neighbors helping each other out. We've seen mutual aid networks pop up around the country. And the reality that like your neighbors and community members keep you safe in ways that police officers do not. And so I think it's important to leverage the lessons from the pandemic and sort of say, well, actually, we can sort of create a world that doesn't rely on police officers to do every single social service that exists under the sun. Relatedly, we have also lessons about techno-solutionism and trying to have Apple and Google jump in and save us and provide contact tracing. In reality, it didn't end up providing much of anything, and then just created another data grabbing situation that didn't do much of anything to help anyone. So there are lessons there about not assuming that we need tech for everything. And I think that we're also, even though we did undergo a pandemic, we also underwent a national uprising around racism and policing. And I think a lot of people that perhaps don't always see the full scope of police surveillance did see drones and social media monitoring and the entire sort of gamut of what police do, which is oftentimes suppress protest. And I think that will open up a lot of eyes into what it actually looks like and how people that think they have nothing to hide. The reality is that if you've ever taken a position that is controversial to the government's position, you are at risk of being sort of targeted by these kinds of systems. So I think there are a lot of lessons that we should draw from in terms of organizing and pushing back. It's also just frankly encouraging to see that we have a better imagination of what's possible, which is not only do we have to not accept that some of these tools are going to be inevitable, we've actually already seen through work like from people like Kade and others that you actually can push back, and that you actually can undo systems like facial recognition. You can abolish predictive policing. You can get rid of these things, and all that stands in the way is people organizing and actually doing so.
And I think
can I just add something to that? I love this question. It made me look up one of my favorite Ursula K. Le Guin quotes. So she said, this is about capitalism. She said, "We live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable. So did the divine right of kings. Any human power can be resisted and changed by human beings." And I think that's really important because we frequently, including those of us who do this work, get really discouraged by the sheer magnitude of this problem. We're not just dealing with the government here. We're dealing with the most powerful corporations on earth, the wealthiest people on earth who profit off of, sucking up every imaginable bit of data about, billions of people around the world. But those are fundamentally human and political problems. Thank God we're not having a conversation about climate change, something that, we may have set forces, off that we won't be able to rein back in. This is not one of those circumstances. Surveillance cameras can be smashed. I'm not advocating that we do that, but they can be. Human beings can take a hatchet to that and just cut it off. And we can do that through political organizing as well. We can do it. We've done it in Boston. We've done it in many communities across the country. Really what it takes is shifting political power in this country so that people like Jeff Bezos are not in charge of decision-making in Washington, D.C. about data protection, about things like police surveillance and what types of tools and technologies and data processes they'll be able to use to control us and manipulate us. It's not actually a technological problem. It's purely a political one. So, if folks are concerned about this, I would suggest get involved at the local level. It's difficult in New York because of the power of the NYPD, but in many other parts of the country, it's actually not very difficult to mobilize a relatively small group of people to make real changes with respect to how your police department conducts surveillance in your community. And the final thing I'll say about that is the other thing that we can do as individuals is just refuse to be afraid. We've heard since 9/11 that we have to be afraid of our Muslim brothers and sisters. We've heard recently from the Trump administration that we have to fear immigrants from south of the border. We've heard now over the past few months from many people in police unions and others that we have to fear some sort of, mystical crime wave that's taking over cities across the United States. And the response to all of those prompts is that we give more power and more of our information away to these unaccountable actors who, by the way, don't even give us safety when we hand over all of that information. Astonishingly, murder solve rates in many communities across the country have gone down since police departments have acquired all of this, incredibly powerful surveillance and military type equipment. So that's the final thing I would just say, is that you have to refuse to buy into it. Don't be afraid.
I mean, that quote is spectacular, Kade, and that warmed my heart. Ángel, your answer, Lynn. I mean, these are all incredible themes to hold on to, and I just, when we think of what we turn to for safety and support in the midst of the pandemic, it wasn't our Ring security camera that was helping us find the next meal or helping people get by while they were just struggling to get a PPP loan or get unemployment. It was neighbors. It wasn't the tech. And one thing I want to think about in the way that the technology is shaping the discourse is just thinking about how the physical form of these technologies, both in reality and in literature and science fiction, in the in all of these mediums around us, how is that shaping the way we think about the impact that these tools have on us? And maybe Lynn, we can start with you for that.
I think there's enormous impact of what we create. I mean, in the pandemic of 100 years ago, right after that, the first work about a robot was written, called RUR, a Czech play. And a year after that, Metropolis came out. So I think that when we're under these systems of isolation, that art will tell a different story than we hear anywhere else. And I think that we have to be sensitized to look at overcoming the problems that this particular generation is faced with, and find new ways of creating a metaphor to live by. Again, so that we could survive beyond it. And I trust in that.
So Ángel, Kade, what do you think about all this, and not just the way this technology is portrayed in fiction, but the billions of dollars spent on marketing this surveillance technology to us as something friendly rather than something Orwellian?
Yeah, there's Dr. Ruha Benjamin has this example she often shares that I'm going to shamelessly steal, which is an advertisement from the late 50s about a robot. And the ad says, "Don't worry, soon we're going to have slaves again. Don't worry, we mean robot slaves." And it really just begs the question, who's had slaves, and who is it that we're trying to boss around? And you see it work even in newer technologies. Like I keep seeing this ad for a smart faucet that you command to pour out a certain amount of water. It's like, do you want to boss somebody around that badly to yell at your faucet to pour some water? But to your point about the way that it's packaged, it makes a huge difference. I mean, to a certain extent, Ring technology has sort of, well, I should say probably activists have done this, but it's easy to sort of say one ring to rule them all, sort of thinking about sort of an all-seeing eye. But Google offers the same product, but their product is called the Hello Doorbell. It sounds so much more friendly, and they really manage to sort of avoid a lot of attention, even though a lot of the same systems that Ring, or features that Ring offers, are also offered by Google. Google's cameras already have facial recognition, so it'll ping the controller of the camera anytime a known face shows up, which could be used to track a housekeeper, it can be used to track someone, a crush that you're interested in. There's so many uses that are more nefarious that oftentimes just go unnoticed because of sleek, happy, positive messaging. So it really is important to sort of push back on that and sort of look a little bit deeper behind some of the messaging.
And Kade, what
And
about, oh, sorry, go ahead, Lynn.
Oh, just the idea of creating counter messages, so that we can create some choices and don't have to accept the one that appears to be dominant.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that I think a lot of, especially mid 20th century science fiction, like Philip K. Dick's work, was written to warn human beings about what could unfold if we allowed, you know, people to use technology to control us. And unfortunately, people in power seem to have taken those instructions as like a manual for what to do instead of a warning for what not to do. So I would just say, you know, there are two kind of competing issues there. I think one is that sci-fi, like the book and the film Minority Report, have allowed the public to see kind of the end game of a lot of this stuff, right? And it is frightening. At the same time, and so because of that, you know, it's provided us with a popular culture reference point when we talk to lawmakers and members of the public and journalists about the dangers inherent to face surveillance, for example. We can point to Minority Report and say, that's not supposed to be a roadmap, right, for a free society. That was a warning. And people get what we're talking about. At the same time, though, there's a kind of normalization of technologies like face surveillance that Hollywood has been engaged in for a long time. So I think they're, you know, competing kind of dynamics that come into play with how the public perceives technology in the present as a result of, you know, what folks have ingested in terms of pop culture and science fiction. But, you know, I think we need to make the best of it, frankly, and point people towards the idea that, you know, this was not actually supposed to normalize these concepts for us. It was supposed to be a warning for us to think very, very carefully and critically about the technologies we develop and how we use them.
And maybe we need more stories with superheroes that are human and that are able to override the technological robots or AI systems that attempt to oppress us. And I don't see any of that right now, but I think maybe those are the stories that have to come into our imagination and be launched out.
Yeah, and oh, sorry, Ángel, go ahead.
I just kind of wanted to jump in a little bit because I think we've talked a lot about sort of predictive policing and how sort of it can end up sort of take messed up data and sort of lead people to go to the same places. But I think oftentimes that we actually have increasing examples in real life of what actually happens. And I think one of the things around predictive policing is that there are a lot of unforeseen, at least for some people, consequences around what could happen. So a good example is a predictive policing program in Chicago put together a list of people who were likely to be involved in gun violence, either because of their associations or past criminal records or things like that. And so the police would go to an individual's home, check in on him, go to his work, check in on him. And all of his neighbors saw him constantly talking to police and never walking out in handcuffs. And it created the perception that this person was cooperating with law enforcement and actually ended up getting him shot. So there are sort of situations where when you treat data as like a destiny and it's sort of the way that the data perceives you, actually end up reinforcing really negative outcomes. And similarly, when you sort of constantly use data to harass people because you think that they're gangsters, you end up sort of pushing people further into the margins of society, sort of reinforce visions of them not belonging in mainstream culture. Think of a quote by a writer named Roberto Lavalli who said, I'm going to sort of paraphrase, but he said, you keep treating me like a dog, I'll bite back like a wolf. So there really is this danger of treating predictive analytics actually creating the very sort of reality that they're trying to prevent.
Completely. I mean, this technology tells us that it will predict the future, but really just, creates self-fulfilling prophecies. And I think that there's such a danger with all of these technologies that they are sold to the public with the rhetoric of objectivity, but really they are no more objective, no more predictive than any human being, and oftentimes less so. But I could ask you questions for the entire time, but I see that our audience has already sent in a lot of amazing questions. So I want to start by asking, this is from Julie. There's a lot of information in this discussion about how we're surveilled, but there doesn't seem to be a way to function securely in online society. So how do we, reconcile the struggle between convenience and security? And I'll open this up to anyone.
Well, my answer to that is very similar to the answer that I gave before about how do we get out of this mess. These are political problems. Individuals should not be, I think that the example of the FDA with food and drug security is a really good one here as an analogy. We don't expect individual families and people to test their own food for contaminants, right? We don't expect individual people to know exactly what the safety features of a car ought to look like and to be able to determine whether or not, their car is safe. We have laws that protect the public and the public interest when it comes to, water and food safety. Sometimes those laws fail, obviously, in the case of Flint and many other places. But, the aspiration is that our government is going to protect us from eating bad food, from eating, drinking poisoned water, from driving in a car that's about to, going to explode when we drive down the highway. And the same has to be true here. It cannot be up to individuals, particularly given how many children use iPads and cell phones and the internet today, to protect our digital privacy on the internet or through our phones. We need Congress and state legislatures to step up and do something that is very politically difficult, which is essentially to drive a stake through the heart of the 21st century business model for the internet. We need to come up with a different way of, allowing people to access information online that does not involve, the wholesale harvesting of people's personal data, and then a kind of no holds barred free for all in terms of what companies and individuals are allowed to do with that information. So it has to be a political solution.
Yeah, I echo 100% what Kate said. I think that it's really a false choice, the way corporations make us think about your voluntariness and how you chose to give up your data and how you chose to sort of, when you're on social media, the feed that you get is a collection of what you choose to interact with. There's a lot of putting the blame on the person that's using the technology instead of really thinking through the choices that the corporations made. And to Kate's point, the way in which you've just decided to let this be the way that the internet works. It doesn't have to be this way. And I think it's really important to keep pushing back on the idea that you have voluntarily given up this information. And to be, one of the lawyers on the conversation, like the Supreme Court is starting to move in that direction already. They have already said that, certain things like a cell phone, you kind of need it. It's sort of indispensable to participate in modern society. So even though, yes, your location information and certain other data is shared with a telephone provider, that doesn't mean you give up all expectations of privacy in that data just because you have a cell phone and turn over some data to a vendor. I think that needs to continually be built on and expanded to cover more and more of the reality of our online life.
I think also that each generation recreates itself in a more profound way towards survival, and I think that what needs to happen is a different form of encryption to be developed as a different language for survival, other than the one that we've been fed. The words that we've been fed, we have to have new meanings, new systems of going beneath that.
I couldn't agree more with all of that. And one thing I'll add is that even if we don't have the will as a society to block these, tech giants from taking this data as the price of modern life, that doesn't mean we have to allow the government to then have the right to access it the way they do, because that poses such an additional layer of harm on top of it. But I again have to be cognizant of the time. We have a couple of questions from Jeanette about the insurrection on January 6th. Both the fact that these technologies have reportedly been used against some of the right-wing hate groups that attacked the Capitol that day, and also the fact that many of the insurrectionists appeared to have almost no concern about privacy at that day, like openly giving interviews and advertising their participation in the attack. So how do you how do you reconcile those themes with the broader stance that you have on these surveillance technologies? Kade?
Sure. Yeah, I have some thoughts on that. I mean, one is that it's always frustrating when the security state fails massively, even though we give it billions and billions and billions of dollars every year to protect us. And then trots out, a technology like facial recognition to save the day, right? And justify the use of a technology that for the past few years has come under a considerable amount of scrutiny and has faced a lot of protest from the Black Lives Matter movement, from the ACLU, from various civil rights, civil liberties, racial justice organizations across the country, including actually from researchers. Joy Blumwini is a MIT researcher who conducted a very famous study in 2018, finding that facial recognition algorithms were more prone to misclassify Black women than anyone else. And in fact, at astonishingly high rates, 1 in 3 Black women were misclassified in the test she did. And the technology worked almost all the time for white men. So, a couple of things. One, the FBI and the Capitol Police failed. They should have protected the building. That never should have happened in the first place. And so we should be holding those agencies' feet to the fire instead of, giving them more authority to use dangerous technology like face surveillance. The second issue, though, is that the technology doesn't work all that well, actually. In real world conditions, it's not particularly useful in many cases. And even when it works, like it did in some of these cases at the Capitol, I think we have to be really, really cautious about throwing away our civil rights and civil liberties because we happen to like the fact that certain people were targets of the surveillance. We know, and in fact, a recent Government Accountability Office report just published last week conclusively tells us that a number of federal government organizations, I think it was like 6, used facial recognition to determine the identities of people who were at Black Lives Matter protests in the summer of 2020. That's how the technology is going to be used mostly on a day-to-day basis by state, local, and federal police in the United States to target Black and brown people in the war on drugs, which continues to be the #1 driver of government surveillance in the United States, to target Muslims in the ongoing so-called war on terror, to target leftists and environmentalists who are protesting the construction of pipelines and standing up for our climate future. So I just, I really hesitate to throw away our rights not to be, monitored biometrically by the government merely because in one instance, when the government itself failed massively to do what it should have done in the first instance, that it happened to be useful in that case. I'll just give another example. The Fourth Amendment exists in the Constitution, right? It would be a lot easier for the police to solve crimes if it didn't. So we historically in this country have been very comfortable with creating limits and enforcing those limits on what the government is able to do in terms of violating our privacy. Those limits do sometimes make the government's job more difficult when they need to solve a murder or investigate something like the Capitol attack. But that doesn't mean that we ought to throw out those checks and balances, or in some cases, prohibitions on the government's use of certain types of technology.
Ángel?
Yeah, again, I agree with Kade. Very smart. I would add, it's one of those things where, again, we have these situations where there's a massive failing, and then we say, well, so we need more stuff to do this job. And if you see the footage of what happened, the police could have just arrested somebody when they were breaking into the Capitol building. But in reality, they were not only just standing by, they were also in some situations opening the door and letting them into the Capitol building. So to pretend that this was some sort of like failure of not having the right technology, or we need to have more surveillance capabilities to go after people, when in reality, they either stood by or actively encouraged the insurrection, it really just like baffles my mind that that's something that's worthwhile. And to Kate's point about fusion centers, there's reporting that they were getting a bunch of information, but you know what it was from? It was saying Antifa is going to come into town, and that's what we need to worry about. And we need to sort of, share a lot of sort of unreliable sources from what the Daily Caller and other news sources saying, we really have to be on the lookout for these Antifa guys because they're the ones that are going to cause problems. The idea that we're going to be able to predict things with more information is just like time and time again proving itself false. And I think we need to do a better analysis of what it is that we want our police departments to be doing, instead of saying that the problem with policing is just that they're not well equipped.
That they're not what?
That they're not well equipped enough. Lynn, what about you? Do you have thoughts on that response to 1.6?
You know, I do think that that people knew about it, obviously, and were not prepared for the range that it led to. I think it was, and I mean, I'm encouraged at how many people have been arrested, and just from massive identification of video, not necessarily facial recognition, but people actually posting images on the internet and being able to find people that could recognize them. I don't think that it's going to happen. I mean, I really hope that it won't happen in the future. I think that we will be better equipped for protection in the future.
And one historical analog I wanted to bring in for this discussion is the aftermath of the Oklahoma City attack, where we passed a horrible bill called the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996, a bill that was supposedly going to be targeted at right-wing extremists, but was systematically used to target, BIPOC defendants with harsher sentences, with more investigative tools, and even used by the Trump administration to accelerate a series of executions in his last days in office. So it's one of these, there is this lesson from history that when we expand powers in the name of targeting white assailants, oftentimes those very same powers are turned on BIPOC communities. Turning to a different direction, there's a question about antitrust, and really, that can seem like a bit of a departure from the surveillance topic, but we've talked about how a lot of this surveillance technology is driven by these corporate conglomerates. And do you see hope that this expanded drive to use antitrust power to break up tech giants might provide us with another pathway to fight for privacy protections, for civil rights? And happy to start with anyone. Ángel.
Yes. I'm not an antitrust expert, so I'm not going to opine on the sort of way to go forward, but I will sort of say that cautionary note here is that a lot of the bigger technology companies are what get a lot of the headlines, but there are a number of smaller vendors that exist that are offering all kinds of snake oil and share information with law enforcement under all kinds of circumstances. And so the idea that breaking up these companies alone will be enough to help us is sort of, I want to make sure that we're sort of keeping an eye on some of the smaller vendors that are oftentimes offering tools for free to law enforcement. I think the most clear example of that is companies like Clearview AI, who have undergone no evaluations and are sort of being used willy-nilly. The same report that Kade mentioned from the GAO showed that there were 14 different federal agencies that are using private facial recognition technologies with no oversight and no sort of even understanding of who's using it or for what purpose. So it is important to stay aware that there are also smaller companies that are playing. And so yes to antitrust, but also we have to keep at it.
Yeah, I mean, I would only add to that, yes, and I think one of the values of antitrust work, if it's successful, is that it reduces the power of organizations like Facebook and Google and Amazon. And by reducing the power of those organizations, we create opportunities for public interest advocacy groups to have more influence on lawmaking and rulemaking in Washington, D.C. with respect to privacy.
Well, turning from the tech giants to their captive audience, we have a question about millennials and whether they think about the amount of data that's being collected on them. Sheila asks if this is a generational concern, where we've seen a shift in how much people care about this sort of data being tracked. Happy to open that up to anyone.
guess as a millennial, I care. And I think that it's one of those things where, again, we shouldn't sort of be putting 100% of the onus on people to make all of these choices, when in reality, their ability to make decisions is very limited by companies. I think that to a certain extent, if we think about, we've talked about background checks and that sort of thing, sometimes done by high-tech methods, but also sometimes just done by ordinary methods. I think most people feel like they have to have a LinkedIn profile, they have to have some sort of like digital footprint to indicate to employers or to other people that they are a normal human being. Sometimes within social circles, you kind of have to open yourself up to be public. We have a situation where a lot of people are sort of having to build careers through influencing and other kinds of things, and that requires them to have public personas that may not reflect who they are in real life. There's a lot of situations where the way in which the modern economy works pushes people towards having social media presences, but that doesn't mean that that's exactly who they are. And it doesn't mean that we need to accept all the inferences that are made by it as sort of an inevitable trade-off for being a public person.
Yeah, I would just add to that. I think people do care. I think boomers care. I think Gen X people care. I think millennials care. Gen Zers definitely care because they have grown up in the digital world, and they know full well what types of information companies are collecting about them. I think, as Ángel said, we can't allow individuals to be responsible for this problem. We also, though, have to look at the hierarchy of needs in the United States. I frequently have conversations with elected officials where they tell me things like, well, you're telling me that, passing this privacy law is extremely important, but I'm really only hearing about it from a handful of organizations. I don't hear about this when I talk to my constituents. And my response to that is, yes, because we don't have Medicare for all in this country. People don't have health care. People are worried about not taking an ambulance to the hospital because they'll get a $40,000 bill in the mail. People are struggling in every single major urban area in this country to afford rent. Many people during the pandemic couldn't put food on the table. So I think that if we're going to be able to seriously address a lot of these problems, again, they're political problems, we're going to have to make our society more equal to begin with, so that ordinary people have the time to actually pay attention to these issues. They're not working 4 jobs, struggling to take care of their kids, put food on the table, pay their rent, worrying about medical bankruptcy. I don't think it's a surprise, actually, that Europe, the EU, has among the world's strongest data protection regulations. Now, the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulations, are not by any means a silver bullet, but it is so far, a government's best attempt at reining in some of this corporate data collection and giving people more power in terms of how corporations use their information. And I don't think that's an accident. Europe overall has a much lower level of inequality than the United States does. Many European countries do provide better benefits to their citizens, provide things like socialized medicine. And so, it's not shocking to me that a place that has an overall more equal society has also moved in the direction of taking some of these issues more seriously.
And I see that we're actually over time, but I want to make sure that we leave people with a step that they can take, because we know that this can be a lot to hear. We know that this can be a stark reality to wake up to if it's not one you've already been thinking about. I just want you to each take 30 seconds and tell people what is the thing they can do to feel like they have the power to push for a future that the future that they want. And maybe happy to start with anyone. And maybe if no one's jumping.
Okay, I'll jump.
Okay, Kade.
So 30 seconds. Donate to the ACLU. Vote. Fight back against all of these insanely anti-democratic voting restrictions that are popping up all over the country. Because again, none of the things that we're talking about here are possible if we don't fix our democracy. So I think those are the most important things. And be political, get engaged. And again, I would say, refuse to be scared when politicians and police tell you ought to fear this so-and-so and this community or those people. Don't buy into it.
Lynn, Ángel, what's the one step you recommend?
Lot of prediction is based on logic. That's what started this whole thing, trying to predict where wars were going to occur, but logic itself is something that paralyzes the heart. And Ada Lovelace, who wrote the first computer program, was really concerned about what she termed the soul of the engine, and what would happen to the drives that mutated over time. So my advice is to pay attention to the soul of our individuals, and make decisions that are based on a broader spectrum of care, and that can encrypt and reinvent different languages that will allow us to live more humanely.
And Ángel, in just a few seconds, what do you think is most important for folks to do?
Like everyone said, get involved at the local level. If you're in New York City, get involved with STOP, get involved with a bunch of other organizations that are doing great work. Check out coalitions to abolish the gang database in New York City, get involved with movements to get rid of facial recognition in New York State. There's so many things you can do to get involved, but you have to participate. And most importantly, don't give in to fear.
And I just will shamelessly plug our website, stopspying.org, and our partners at the Privacy New York Coalition, who are fighting every day in New York to try to push back against these horrific technologies. And with that, I want to hand it back to our hosts at the Highline. But thank you again to everyone for kicking off this series with such an amazing conversation. And thank you for everyone who tuned in tonight.
Thank you, Albert, and everyone. I'll dive in quickly. So there were a number of questions about AI and algorithms and questions about resources. And I will remind folks that our second talk in this series is on July 21st at 12 p.m. Eastern, and will be specifically about artificial intelligence and algorithms, titled How We Train Surveillance Tools, featuring Chris Gilliard, Meredith Whitaker, and Mimi Onuha, who is quoted in Lynn's film, and Lynn also quoted earlier in our talk. So if you haven't signed up yet, we're going to drop the link in the chat there. And then there will be 4 more conversations, 2 in September and 2 in October. So you can keep signing in to learn more and gain other resources from the amazing folks who will be joining us. Briefly, thank you. I really can't thank y'all enough. This was incredible. Albert, Lynn, Kade, and Ángel for this conversation. I have to shout out all of our colleagues behind the scenes who've made this event and all of them possible. Constanza, Jamie, Nadia, Harish, Carly, Misha, Janelle, Cecilia, Mauricio, and so many more, as well as our advisory team. If folks are looking for resources and people whose work to follow, we have an amazing group of organizers who've been guiding the development of all of these events. The Center for Constitutional Rights, Immigrant Defense Project, Media Justice, Mi Gente, Empower Change, and Reprieve. So you can look at their work as well. I want to thank the members of the Highline Plinth Committee who make this event and everything around the Plinth possible, and of course everyone who's attended this event. So to learn more about the following events and events in this series, again, we're dropping the link in the chat. You can also sign up for our newsletter to make sure to stay up to date, and we'll keep the chat, event live for just a couple more minutes. And thank you, everyone. We will see you all on July 21st, and then later in September and October. Thank you again, y'all, and we'll see you out there.